Joe Rogan, what happened to you, man? You went from being an interesting critical thinker to a hardcore partisan right-wing hack who slurps up the propaganda like there's no tomorrow. Well, look, so many people have been talking about Joe Rogan's decline. They've been talking about how, he used to be interesting and now he's just a right-winger. So I feel like I should offer my perspective. A lot of these people, of course, are progressives and leftists. So I think I should chime in. I'm not one of those people who thinks that, if you're not a leftist, you might as well be right-wing or you must have joined MAGA. No, I'm more nuanced than that. I recognize that, for example, if I say we should have universal health care and you say I disagree, that doesn't automatically mean you're a right-winger. You could be a centrist. You could be a leftist who happens to disagree with universal health care. It is possible. People have all different assortments of beliefs. But it just so happens that Joe Rogan's assortment of beliefs almost universally tend to be lining up with MAGA. And to the extent that they don't, they're offset by the pro-Trump rhetoric that he spews on the daily. So Joe Rogan, of course, endorsed Trump in November. Previously, he said, no, I wouldn't endorse that guy. No, I endorse Bernie Sanders. I support same-sex marriage. I support universal health care, universal basic income, all of these progressive social issues, lots of progressive economic issues. 2020 comes around, he's not a Biden guy, but he's not a Trump guy. He doesn't like that Joe Biden's old and just seems weak and a neoliberal, boring too, just an establishment guy. And Trump, in his mind, was at least an anti-establishment guy in 2020, even though he did not resort to voting for him, and he still was critical of Trump. There's even footage of him after the 2020 election. And although after the 2020 election he was not a fan of Biden, he was still criticizing Trump. He was saying January 6th was terrible. He wasn't drinking up the Kool-Aid on it of like, well, it was just a couple angry boomers, they just went through the Capitol and acted a little tough and nobody got hurt except Trump supporters, right? So yeah, it actually was not that bad and BLM was a trillion times worse, right? So now what do we have? We have a guy who totally ignores all of Trump's lies, who points at the Democrats whenever the Democrats say something that is inconsistent with the truth, or even when they say things that are true, he accuses them of lying. For example, he hyperfixated on Tim Walz for supposedly stretching the truth. He's like, this guy's the biggest liar. I can't believe people wanted this guy to be vice president. He should never have been vice president. He would be terrible in that position. And yet he ignores that Donald Trump is a horrific liar, that he has told over 30,000 lies in his first term. He keeps doing it into his presidency. His second term might even be worse. Who knows? And policy-wise, it's definitely going to be worse. And Joe Rogan of 2020 would totally agree that the 2025 Trump is worse than the 2017 to 2021 Trump. But Joe Rogan, what happened with this shift, this seismic shift? 2016, he's a Bernie Sanders supporter. He brings on Bernie Sanders in 2019 during the Democratic primaries, has a really enjoyable chat with him. They schmooze it up. And they talk about economic issues. He gives Bernie Sanders a platform to talk about economic issues from a progressive perspective. And you know what? At the same time, he happens to give a lot of right-wingers a platform to talk about economic issues and especially social issues. You have Ben Shapiro a lot of the time going on there and talking about social issues from a right-wing perspective, kind of giving his, facts and logics vibes type thing, making those arguments. And you know what? It's totally fine. You want to serve as a platform for right-wingers and left-wingers. That is totally cool. You want to schmooze it up with them, show that people on the right and people on the left get along with me because I'm that cool. That's kind of the sense that I got from it. And you know what? I sort of understand that. I have right-wing and left-wing friends, and I kind of feel good about myself in the sense that I'm able to be friends with both those people, that these people with wildly different perspectives, hard right anarchist types, Trump supporters, Democrats, people who borderline call themselves Marxists, socialists, all those types of people. Like the fact that we're able to chill out and grab a glass of wine or something and talk politics on occasion, that's cool. So Joe Rogan, I totally understand what you were doing. Nowadays though, what exactly is going on with this podcast? This podcast brings on some of the wealthiest people ever to spew regime propaganda. Just propaganda like, hey, the CFPB, they're debanking me. That's what Mark Andreessen said. Just a bunch of lies. Oh yeah, it's Elizabeth Warren's personal agency that she uses for fun. Like, she's not even the director of it. She was someone who supported the legislation that created it, but she was not the director of it. What on earth are you going on about? And Joe Rogan did not challenge any of it. He used to, at least on social issues, sometimes challenge right-wing guests. For example, Matt Walsh said that he greatly exaggerated some statistic on transgender people, and Joe Rogan got Jamie to fact check it, and he said, oh yeah, it's way less than that. So Matt Walsh was like, oh geez, whoa, really? So I give credit to Joe Rogan for that. Nowadays, he wouldn't do that. He probably knows that his audience would greet him with some horrendous backlash if he did it. So what exactly changed? What exactly changed with this man? He went from supporting Bernie Sanders to now dunking on a guy who has very similar politics to Bernie Sanders, Tim Walz, saying he's a liar, saying he's like Mao Zedong. So I have to say that I get the sense that between 2017 and 2024, Joe Rogan got the sense that the winds were blowing in a different direction, that the Trump people were more the edgy outsiders. Previously, it seemed like, oh, they're the Trump people, they had the presidency from 2017 to 21. And yeah, he's enacting policies that are hurtful to immigrants, and it's cool to be the resistance and stand up against this. But in 2024, you could argue that Trump was the resistance. His resistance against the Biden-Harris administration, I mean, he criticized them for inflation, and Joe Rogan was like, oh yeah, that resonates with me, prices are high, Biden's old, they got to do something about this old guy, he might have dementia. Trump was making fun of that, while at the same time, Trump himself had plenty of gaffes that could be chalked up to an age-related issue, but maybe not, because he's got so much energy. To his credit, he's got a lot of energy when he speaks. He's got what some people call riz, some people call charisma, depends if you're old school or not. But yeah, he can get up there and give an energetic, loud, bombastic speech and totally make up for the fact that he's an old dude. You totally forget about it. You might think he's like 58 or something rather than 78. But Joe Rogan gets behind him, and you know what I think he did that because of? He did it because it felt cool. It felt cool. It feels cool and edgy to support the guy who everyone is telling you is cool and edgy. He also moved to Texas, which could be a big deal. Texas is not the reddest of red states. That would be someplace like Oklahoma, Tennessee, Alabama, those types of places. But you know what? Texas is still known as a conservative bastion. And if you get in the right areas there, you will be swimming in a red sea of Republicans who are like, yeah, Trump's cool and edgy and government bad. And so Joe Rogan's like, yeah, no. Government bad, Trump good, he's fighting the establishment. And so he has this interview with Trump. He barely talks about any of the actual issues with him. He throws him a bunch of softball questions. And I think he just felt so giddy, he got butterflies in his tummy, as I say, after that interview. And then just before the election, the night before the election, he goes and endorses Trump. And, Kamala Harris probably didn't do the Democratic Party any favors. She didn't go on with Joe Rogan. She could have, but I think he felt some antipathy toward the fact that Harris did not actually go through the primary. Now, of course, Biden went through the primary, and Joe Rogan still didn't like him. But it's like, okay, the VP gets to take over without a single vote. He probably had some resentment toward that. And since he's in a lot of these right-wing circles, that was a common talking point to bash Kamala Harris. It was like, she got 0 primary votes. I got just as many primary votes in the Democratic primary as she did, so I should be the Democratic nominee. Why does this loser get to be? It's like, well, because she's a VP. But, they bashed her a lot, and, they used a lot of identity politics against her. They used a lot of identity politics in favor of Trump. And yeah, they were like, oh, Trump, he's so cool. He's the first convicted felon president. That's so edgy. I'm voting for the felon. They targeted him with lawfare. So that victim sense, the sense of being a victim and being edgy, vote for the felon, that's edgy. Now, if Kamala Harris were a felon and people said they were voting for her, they would laugh at you and say that's not edgy, and they would say that you support crime and you're not tough on crime, and you're for open borders, and you're for chaos, and you don't support rule of law, so you're an idiot. But if you support Trump the felon, you're cool and edgy, because obviously the only reason Trump would get convicted is because the evil Democrats rigged the justice system against him or something like that, and he's a Republican and he's a threat to the establishment, and that's exactly why they're prosecuting him. There was that. There was the vibes aspect of the assassination attempts. You got to admit, that picture of Trump shaking his fist and yelling, fight, 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 it's historic. It won over people who are surface level voters, who are like, oh, okay, cool. A good picture of him. Yeah, that's cool. So I'm sure that type of thing played into Joe Rogan's mindset and his decision and his changing. We have to also talk about COVID-19. So Trump obviously was president during the first portion of COVID-19, actually a minority of it, 2020 to the start of 2021. And he presided over some lockdowns, but he did not lock the entire country down. He presided over the creation of the vaccine, boasted about Operation Warp Speed, though has kind of backpedaled on that. And then, yeah, Biden campaigns obviously on more lockdowns. mask mandates. Never really did a mask mandate, never did a national lockdown or anything like that. But he was campaigning on being tougher on the virus. And Trump acquiesced to Fauci a lot. He still gave Fauci a lot of leeway. But then he was like, oh yeah, no, I don't like Fauci anymore. And they kind of split. And Joe Rogan probably is like, yeah, no, I don't like Fauci. I don't like the vaccine. And you know what? Look, he's definitely entitled to his opinion on that. Being distrusting of the government is not inherently a bad thing. But taking that and just using that to morph your entire set of political views, using that as an excuse, like, oh, this guy doesn't like some guy in the government that I think is bad, so therefore I'm gonna like this guy. Like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So yeah, the Fauci thing, the COVID thing, the vaccine thing, that whole thing kind of turned the enemy of his enemy into his friend. Even though Trump isn't necessarily the ultimate anti-COVID precaution candidate. He didn't like to wear a mask. There are a lot of pictures of him without a mask. He himself got COVID and came back and was like, yeah, it's no big deal. It's just a cold. And the vaccine was created under him. So I don't know what Joe Rogan's deal is, but COVID seemed to have broken his brain. I think that another issue is that, yeah, the whole trust the science thing during that, it probably got to him. He's like, oh yeah, no, experts don't know anything. Actually, I'm the real smart guy. I bring on these billionaires who don't know anything about science, but who can talk a good game on finance or something like that and spout a bunch of really sleazy, well-spoken, well-crafted lies. And that's really cool and edgy. And I know his subreddit's still making fun of him at least. So that we've got that. But yeah, he doesn't seem to be super responsive to audience feedback, but he could be. I don't know if he's like aware that he's cultivated a far-right audience in some ways. Although he's losing a lot of his lefty audience and they're making fun of him. But yeah, he's overly trusting of ultra billionaires, ultra wealthy people, people who supposedly have made it in life under the idea that, well, they must be brilliant because they're wealthy. Well, a lot of the times, actually, they just inherited that wealth. The harder you work, the further you go is true to some extent, but it's not the full deal. And Joe Rogan, I think, very much buys into that. It's kind of part of the whole thing of like, oh, self-improvement being right-wing, which that's a whole different discussion to have. But it's like, oh yeah, these people made it. They're right-wingers. I don't know any left-wingers who made it. He probably does know plenty. But he's like, yeah, no, this feels cool. It feels tough, being a right-winger. Like you've overcome adversity. And he sees Trump as overcoming adversity, even though he was born with a big fat silver spoon in his mouth. But, he got convicted, and Joe Rogan would probably say, oh, the Democrats went after him. And then there was 2 assassination attempts. But yeah, nowadays it's like he's just dunking on Democrats time and again, totally ignoring that a lot of the criticisms he makes at Democrats could also be made of Republicans. For example, free speech. Democrats have some problems on free speech. I will grant him that. I will grant him that Tim Walz misspoke when he said that the First Amendment does not protect hate speech or misinformation, as well as the Biden administration when they erred under the First Amendment when they basically advised social media companies to censor vaccine skeptical posts and so-called COVID misinformation on their platforms. You cannot do that. You cannot do that under the First Amendment. The government cannot tell private companies to do that. That's the government essentially censoring them. But the Republican Party, we look at Trump and his authoritarian way of handling the media, trying to silence them through lawfare, as well as his call for flag burners, not only to face jail time, but he has even suggested that they lose their citizenship. So Joe Rogan just ignores that nonsense. Trump also rounding up pro-Palestinian protesters and potentially having them deported, saying he's going to go after illegal protests. Like, what is an illegal protest? You have to define that. So Joe Rogan's got major blind spots. Either that or he is deliberately being a propagandist. It's got to be one or the other. Well, it could be both. Sometimes people are able to merge these things in a weird way. But yeah, I think that just these past few years have shown us that a lot of people who don't know that much about politics have come to find Trump as a very edgy, cool outsider guy. And that just appeals to them. It might not be that their opinions changed on every issue. Maybe their opinions, like in the case of Joe Rogan, actually changed after they glommed onto Trump. So, he's a Bernie Sanders supporter in 2016. And now in 2024, when Trump is running the most far-right campaign in U.S. history, arguably, modern U.S. history at least, he endorses him. So it's like, what? You went from supporting the most left-wing candidate in 2016 to the most right-wing candidate ever in 2024. How all can you reconcile these things? Well, look, maybe he didn't go from being far left to far right. Maybe he just said, oh, Trump seems cool. So I'm going to change my political opinions. I'm going to associate with all these conservatives, and I'm going to change my opinions to match theirs. I'm going to change my opinions to match Matt Walsh, Charlie Kirk, Ben Shapiro, all these guys, J.D. Vance, all these conservative commentators. They've got it right. They support Trump. And I support Trump because he seems cool and edgy. But now I've got to change my political opinions to match those guys. Could be what went on. Could be. But yeah, he went to his inauguration, which was especially disappointing for a guy who purports to be a free thinker. I'm sorry to say, but he's anything but a free thinker. He's a guy who, as I said, slurped up the propaganda, the hard right propaganda, the propaganda that is so powerful, and that the left-wing media doesn't really hold that much of a candle to. People say CNN and MSNBC are left-wing. They're not really left-wing at all. They have right-wingers on. They say stuff that's critical of Democrats. They are all over the place at times. They're not fans of Trump. We can make that clear. They still give Trump credit where it's due, in their view. But yeah, there's not really that much of a left-wing media, which is a shame. And I'm not necessarily even like a hardcore leftist. I do not support socialism, so to speak. I do not support open borders. I do not support, discrimination against white people or anything that the right accuses left-wingers of supporting. I'm not saying left-wingers support that, but I'm not one of those hardcore critical race theory, DEI fans. I don't hate them in principle, but I just say, you know what, look, these things can be implemented correctly and incorrectly. Right-wingers try to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They say, oh, it's all bad. It's all just toxic hatred against white people. So, yeah, I think we need more people who are in the center politically, who are willing to take on Trump. Show people that you don't have to be a rabid leftist to take on Trump, to criticize Trump. I'm center-left. I go after Trump. I go after Democrats. I go after Biden, for example, when he said that the 28th Amendment was passed under his presidency. The 28th Amendment being, in his words, the Equal Rights Amendment. That did not happen. I went after Kamala Harris for some of her campaign mistakes. I went after Tim Walz for some of his gaffes on the debate stage. So I went after Hillary Clinton, too, for, being corrupt and running a poor campaign in 2016. So there's plenty of problems with Democrats. We need centrists who come along and say, yeah, we acknowledge all those problems with the Democrats. We acknowledge you might be hesitant to vote for them because of those problems. But you can't vote for Trump. And here are the 10.5 billion reasons why. At least 10.5 billion. And we need those people to act as a counter to Joe Rogan. Because Joe Rogan might pretend to be a centrist. He said it himself. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm an American. Very edgy, very unique take, bro. But what you put out there in terms of content does not measure up to that. It's not consistent with what you say. Your content is almost exclusively pro-Republican, Joe. So we need people to come out and say, look, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, but to hell with Donald Trump, to hell with his far-right agenda, to hell with Project 2025, to hell with this Doge and administrative state purging that's going on. This is going to destroy America. It's going to tank the economy. It's going to ruin people's lives. And we need to call that out. And you know what? I'm not a Democratic Party bootlicker. I'm just a thinking American. A thinking American who sees the problem with gutting the government, with handing the economy and the government both over to the destructive hands of Elon Musk and tech oligarch billionaires. That's a problem. And even if you voted Republican in every election up until now, we still welcome you to listen to us, to appreciate what we're saying, and to potentially join the movement, if you can call it a movement. I don't want to be too grandiose here. But yeah, we need a counter to Joe Rogan out there. We need people who are in the center or behave centristy, but can win over Americans and unite them against President Trump. And in a lot of ways, they're already starting to unite against him. His approval rating does suck. But we need to make sure that in 2026, he gets hammered, and that in 2028, whoever's running instead of Donald Trump, whoever is taking on the mantle of MAGA, the heir apparent, probably J.D. Vance, is not going to be able to run away from the specter of Donald Trump's awful reputation and his stench, figuratively and literally, and faces an absolute clobbering in that election. Let's turn those swing states blue again, not because we love Democrats, but because we need to hold Trump and the Republican Party and their far-right agenda that they're trying to pass, that cuts Medicaid and cuts taxes for the uber wealthy and raises taxes on the bottom 95%, that we need to hold those people, those policymakers, those lawmakers accountable for what they have done so far and what they may do between now and January 2029. Let me know what you think in the comments below about Joe Rogan. As always, please like, comment, or subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the More the Merrier, and I look forward to speaking to you in my next video.